Hey YouTube, this is Itchy, and I wanted to give you a 5-minute primer this morning on how radiation gets into our bodies through our food sources, so you understand a little bit about biomagnification and bioaccumulation. There was a very important nuclear detonation that happened in 1961 where the Russians detonated an enormous bomb. In fact, it was called the King of Bombs, or Tsar Bomba, and you can see all kinds of videos of it on YouTube. It was 3,800 times more powerful than the bomb we dropped on Hiroshima, and I believe it was 50 or 60 megatons. They wanted to make it 100 megatons, but it would have blown up the plane that dropped it. Here's a quick video of that explosion. It actually didn't happen on the ground. It happened a mile or two above the ground, which is what they wanted. Now, the important thing that we learned, though, from this detonation is, number one, never ever to do it again. And number two, scientists in the United States, a week after this happened, were able to measure radioactive iodine in the thyroids of mammals. And that was before it even showed up in our air, food, or water, or plants. How does that happen? Well, it happens through the process of biomagnification. And I want to show you a little chart that helped me understand this concept, because to me, when I first heard this, it didn't make sense. It seems that a larger animal at the top of the food chain would get a more diluted dose of radioactivity, but what actually happens is, number one, radioactive particles have a tendency to group together. That's called bioaccumulation, and they do it outside of reactors when they're blowing around in the air, and they also do it when they're in our bodies. Now, in these little organisms, and here this is algae, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 little algae here. If every one of these algae consumed a radioactive particle, and then all 8 of these guys were eaten by this mayfly nymph, well, now this mayfly nymph has 8 radioactive particles in it. And then let's say the sunfish comes along and he eats 3 of these guys, who each ate 8 of these guys. Now this sunfish has 24 radioactive particles. And then the great blue heron comes along and, he eats 3 or 4 or 5 of these fish. And that's how it moves up the food chain. And it happens very quickly, as evidenced by what the scientists picked up just a week after this detonation. Now, when it gets into our body, though, this is where the trouble begins, because we have all these cells in our body that continuously renew themselves. The cells that line the inside of our mouths, down our throat, our esophagus, our stomach lining, our intestinal lining. And when radioactivity gets into these cells, our cells actually have an enormous ability to heal themselves if you're being healthy, if you're eating properly, if you're getting enough sleep, and getting enough of good, healthy foods that combat radiation. A lot of the damage that's done from radioactivity can be repaired by this cell, except if it gets into the middle of the cell, and that's where the DNA is. Now, if this cell is located somewhere in your body where it's going to regenerate into new cells, like in your stomach lining, once this is damaged, when the cell goes to split, then it splits into damaged cells, and that's how cancer starts. Now, we can actually flush the particles out of our bodies by ingesting certain things. Apple cider vinegar is one. There's actually some really good salad dressings that have that. Garlic expressions is one. Ingesting baking soda, which you have to be careful of because it is made of sodium, and it can raise blood pressure. So if you have high blood pressure problems, then you want to use something like bentonite clay, and there is an ingestible kind that you can get at a health food store, and you just mix a spoonful of it into your yogurt or into your tea, or into your kids' oatmeal every day. And it's clay, and plutonium actually binds to clay, and it gets neutralized. And that's why underwater wells are actually the safest areas right now in terms of radioactivity, because the water, when it's filtered through the ground, the particles stay in the clay instead of getting into the well. There's no amount of safe exposure to radiation, and I found this article early on. This was in the Salt Lake Tribune, April 23rd. It was written by an MD who is a member of the Union of Concerned Scientists, and he talks a little bit about how over the last 50 years, how we've learned through nuclear tests and so forth what radioactivity does to the body, and how it's a much more serious problem and serious threat to people's health than anyone ever realized. And he also explains in here, and it's a little bit shocking when you first see this statement, that every pregnant woman in North America right now has radioactive particles such as strontium and cesium in their fetus. And that's how dangerous this situation is, and that's how pervasive it is. And once it's in your food sources, and you're getting it 24/7, from food, air, and water, you have to do some mitigation in order to minimize your risks. And I found this table. I was looking for it in a previous video from this guy. This is a spreadsheet he put together on Google, showing all of the radioactivity that was measured immediately after the Fukushima accident. And in fact, if you look at these dates, 319, 320, 324, and then a lot of the data wasn't even published until April. And none of this testing has been made available to us since. And what the EPA has said about these numbers, and I mean, you can see how many cities this was picked up in, and there's 3 different graphs. This is the plutonium graph. There's a strontium graph and a cesium graph with a list of cities, so I'll make sure to put a link to this at the bottom. But the scale that these people use is based on a one-time exposure, like you coming across radiation in your air, food, or water one time in either a year or your entire life. And if it's less than that number, the EPA says, well, it's not harmful, but it's not taking into account that you're getting hit with this 24/7. There's actually a completely new accumulative data table that needs to be put together, and I'm sure there's some smart people somewhere that's working on that. So I wanted to give you also a quick little slideshow about the early symptoms of radiation sickness. Nausea and vomiting are typically the earliest symptoms of radiation sickness. The higher the dose of radiation, the sooner these symptoms appear, and the worse the prognosis. Someone who starts to vomit within 1 hour of exposure is likely to die. And now that's talking about like if you were very close to a reactor that blew up. Although you can have low-level sickness and be nauseous or vomiting too. So sometimes people will start to vomit and then feel better. Another sign would be nosebleeds, and my girls and I have had nosebleeds off and on all summer, which is something we never have. So that's a little concerning, along with hair loss too that we've noticed. Radiation sickness can cause bleeding from the nose, mouth, gums, and rectum. It can cause people to bruise easily and to bleed internally as well, and even to vomit blood. Depletes the body of platelets, cellular fragments in the blood that are to form clots to control bleeding. Sorry, this is moving kind of slow here. I'll put a link to all this stuff below. Bloody diarrhea. Radiation targets cells in the body that reproduce rapidly, and that includes cells that line the intestinal tract. Radiation sickness causes major irritation of the intestinal lining, resulting in severe and sometimes bloody diarrhea. And you could also notice stomach pain, a lot of noise coming from your stomach and intestines. Areas of skin exposed to radiation may turn red and blister, almost like a severe sunburn. This would be, very concerning, especially if you had been in the rain and gotten wet. The way to mitigate a situation, or as a precaution, especially if your kids, had to walk home from the bus and they got soaked, is to put them in the bathtub and put a bunch of baking soda on there. Baking soda binds to the particles and removes them, and it leaves your skin incredibly soft. I'm actually mixing it into our body wash, our dish soap, the laundry, and it really does soften your skin a lot, and you feel better doing it too, because you might be neutralizing anything that's there, even if it's minute. And baking soda is so cheap. Hair loss. Radiation damages the hair follicles. As a result, people who get a big dose often lose their hair within 2 to 3 weeks. Sometimes the loss of hair is permanent. And my 16-year-old has been losing a lot of hair, and she's had weird bruises too. But other than that, she feels okay, and I know that we're all eating really well. So I mean, that's really all you can do. If you have any of these symptoms and they're more severe, if you went into the hospital for treatment, I mean, all they would do is make sure that you get non-water and food to eat, and they'd give you a blood infusion. There's not really much that they can do outside of that here to manage this if you do it up front, if you do it proactively, than to wait until you're sick. This guy looks pretty sick. Severe fatigue. Radiation sickness can cause people to feel weak and out of sorts, almost like having a bad version of the flu. Sorry, I said 5 minutes and now we're at 13. Mouth ulcers. And it says ulcers could also form in the esophagus, stomach, and intestine. Infections along with red blood cells. Radiation sickness can reduce the risk of infection-fighting white cells in the body. As a result, the risk of bacterial, viral, and fungal infections is heightened. Plus, you have to remember that bacteria, viruses, and funguses also mutate. So we can get stronger versions of these things than on top of our weakened immune system. So that's just a really short list. I'll put together a more comprehensive list in a little more detail that you can pass around. Encourage your kids to do a report about this stuff so that the kids they go to school with learn about it too. And I would include them in this learning process. It's very important because we're going to be living with this for a long time. And I'm going to leave you with a tiny bit of this recording from a very weird civil defense video from the 1950s
When
talking about
radioactive
food.
fallout drifts to the ground, it may look like very fine dust particles. These particles are only dangerous to living things. This fruit would be perfectly safe to eat if you just peel it.
Or wash it and soak it in baking soda.
In disposing of the peelings, remember that they may still contain radioactive material. Canned goods, bottles, or jars should be washed carefully.